They laughed as Olivia flaunted her wealthy fiancé at the table, my parents nodding in pride while their eyes cut through me with contempt, calling me a failure who could never measure up. They didn't know the truth that I was already married to a billionaire, and this dinner would be the beginning of their reckoning. My name is Madison Reed, and this is the night they tried to bury me alive. The chandeliers in my parents' dining room in Greenwich glittered so brightly they almost blinded me when I stepped inside. I had not been home in over a year yet. The house smelled exactly the same lemon polish and expensive wine. My heels clicked against the marble floor as every face turned toward me. My mother Evelyn lifted an eyebrow and whispered something to my father Thomas before forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. Olivia was already standing in the center of the room, glowing in a fitted ivory dress that looked like it had been tailored to prove a point. At her side was a man I had never met. He was tall, sharp suit, perfectly gelled hair, the kind of man who thrived on being looked at. Olivia's hand was draped over his arm as if she were displaying merchandise. "This is Richard Coleman, my fiancé. He's the CFO at Easton Capital," Olivia announced proudly. Gasps and murmurs of approval swept through the room. My parents beamed as though he were a crown jewel they had personally mined. I gave a polite nod. Richard extended his hand, firm grip, cold eyes. He didn't smile, not really. More of a smirk, the kind of expression that told me he had already calculated my worth and found nothing to deposit. Evelyn clinked her glass with a spoon, and the chatter died down. "Tonight is about celebrating Olivia and Richard," she said. "We could not be prouder." I eased into a seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, deliberately chosen for me by my mother, far from the center. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight plates of roasted duck and truffle mashed potatoes arrived, and the atmosphere swelled with the kind of self-congratulation that made my skin crawl. "Do you remember when Olivia won the debate finals in high school?" Evelyn said to the guests. "She has always been the star of this family, and now she has found a man who matches her brilliance," Thomas added with a chuckle. "Meanwhile, Madison was always artistic. But we all know how that turned out." Laughter rolled across the table. I forced my fork into the duck, the skin cracking under the pressure. My cheeks burned, but I kept my voice calm. "I'm doing well, Dad. The gallery in Manhattan has been making strides." A silence, short but heavy, followed. Then Olivia laughed softly, tilting her head like she was humoring a child. "A gallery. That's sweet. Not everyone can handle real competition, I suppose." Richard's eyes flicked toward me. He sipped his wine and spoke with deliberate slowness. "It takes a certain kind of person to survive in finance. Only the strong make it. And the rest of us?" I asked. He smiled without warmth. "They fade away." The table erupted in more laughter. Evelyn reached across to squeeze Olivia's hand. "We always knew you would marry someone extraordinary," she said. "Unlike some people who never seem to measure up." I set my fork down carefully. My pulse was a steady drum in my ears. I wanted to remind them of the nights I stayed up painting until dawn, of the shows I had curated, of the sacrifices I had made alone. But I saw no recognition in their faces, only pride in Olivia, and contempt for me. As the evening dragged on, stories flowed about Richard's business acumen, his vacation homes, his plans with Olivia to travel through Europe after the wedding. Each word was another stone placed on my chest. When dessert arrived, Olivia leaned back in her chair, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight. She turned her gaze on me, her smile razor-sharp. "You know, Madison," she said sweetly, "some people are born to lead to be chosen. Others? Well, they're just not." The room froze for a second, before laughter bubbled again this time. Louder, sharper, cutting into me like glass. My mother clapped her hands together, as if Olivia had told the best joke of the night. I felt the air thicken. My throat ached, but I swallowed hard. I would not give them the satisfaction of tears. I looked at Olivia, her eyes glimmering with triumph, and said nothing. Silence was my shield. But inside me something tightened and refused to bend. I reached for my glass, let the wine slide across my tongue, and let the burn steady me. I smiled not at them, but at myself. They thought they had buried me under their laughter. They had no idea what was waiting to surface. The evening closed with champagne toasts and empty words of blessings for Olivia and Richard. My parents were radiant with pride. I excused myself before the last toast was over. My heels echoed against the marble again. As I walked out into the cold night, the air sharper than the voices still echoing behind me. I did not look back. The cold bit into my skin as I crossed the driveway, my breath turning to white clouds in the darkness. The laughter from inside still clung to me like smoke. I gripped the steering wheel of my car and sat there for a long moment before starting the engine. The headlights swept across the manicured lawn my parents loved so much, and in the silence of the night, old memories pressed against me, unwelcome but relentless. I was 17 again, standing in our living room in Greenwich, with a letter trembling in my hands. My name was printed in bold at the top, the emblem of the Rhode Island School of Design shining like a seal of another life. They had awarded me a statewide scholarship, full tuition, a dream I had painted in my mind since I first held a brush. My heart had pounded so hard that day, I thought it would break my ribs. Evelyn had been in the kitchen pouring herself coffee from the French press. When I rushed in breathless, holding out the letter, she barely glanced at it. She took the pages, scanned the first few lines, and set it down as if it were a grocery coupon. "That's wonderful, Madison," she said flatly. "But we need to be practical." Practical. I had repeated the word confused. "This is a full ride. It covers everything." Thomas came in from the den, still in his golf shirt. He looked at the letter, then at me, then exchanged a glance with Evelyn. "Your sister just got accepted into Westbrook Academy," he said. "It is one of the best private schools in the state. We need to pay the tuition up front." I felt my stomach drop. "But my scholarship, it doesn't cost anything." Evelyn stirred sugar into her coffee. "We need to buy Olivia a reliable car. She will be commuting every day, and her safety is important." I remember gripping the letter tighter, as if the paper itself could anchor me. "What about me?" "You're artistic," my father said with a sigh. "Art is a hobby, not a career. Olivia has a future that can support her family one day." The words had sliced clean through me. I stood frozen, the scholarship letter burning in my hands, while Olivia came downstairs at that very moment, her hair bouncing, her smile wide. She slipped her arms around our father's neck and squealed when he mentioned the car. "What kind?" she asked. "A silver Honda Accord." Thomas answered, grinning like he had just secured a piece of the American dream. Reliable, safe, perfect for a young lady. Olivia clapped her hands together, twirling in the middle of the room. Meanwhile, I was still holding my future in my hands, a future being erased in front of me. Later that week, I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching as Olivia slid behind the wheel of her brand new car. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the hood. She waved at me, radiant, triumphant. My parents stood nearby, their faces shining with pride. I looked down at the scholarship letter, folded, now creased from being clenched so tightly. My eyes blurred, and for a moment the driveway seemed to tilt beneath me. I wanted to scream, to beg them to see me, to see the passion that burned inside me, the talent that had won me recognition across the state. But I knew it would not matter. To them, Olivia was the investment, the safe bet. I was a risk they would not take. That night I locked the letter in the top drawer of my desk. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was proof that I had once been chosen, that I had been enough, even if my family refused to admit it. High school dragged on after that, each day heavier than the last. Olivia drove to school with her friends, music blasting from the car stereo. I rode the bus, clutching my sketchbook to my chest, sketching faces of strangers just to keep from crying. Teachers congratulated me on the scholarship, assuming I would take it, and I learned to nod and smile, lying with every word. At graduation, Olivia's name was called with honors. She strode across the stage, the light catching her glossy hair. My parents stood and cheered. When my name followed, the applause was polite, muted. I walked across the stage and caught Olivia's smirk from the corner of my eye. The years that followed were built on that single betrayal. I worked part-time jobs, saved pennies, enrolled in community college, pieced together credits just to stay connected to art. I rented a small apartment with peeling paint, hung canvases on the wall, told myself I would build something from the ashes they had left me. But every time I walked past a gallery, every time I saw the name Rhode Island School of Design, I felt that familiar ache. A door had been slammed shut in my face by the very people meant to hold it open. I pulled my car into the city that night, the skyline of Manhattan glowing against the dark sky. The memory of Olivia's laughter at the dinner table blended with the sound of her laughter years earlier when she first turned the key in that silver car. Different nights, same song. I parked near my apartment and sat in silence staring at the streetlights. My hands still remembered the feel of that letter, the weight of possibility crushed under someone else's ambition. I thought of Olivia in her designer dresses of Richard, with his hollow smirk of my parents, with their blind adoration. The scholarship letter was still in a box at the back of my closet. I had kept it all these years. Sometimes I took it out unfolded. It ran my fingers over the embossed emblem. It reminded me that I had been enough once, even if my family had refused to see it. I turned off the ignition and leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. The past had always been the wound they pressed against me. But tonight, walking out of that house, I realized something new. The wound was still there, yes, but it had hardened into something else. It had become armor. The morning light bled through the curtains of my apartment, too sharp, too unkind. I was still replaying every word from the night before when my phone rang. Evelyn's voice was clipped and businesslike. "Come by the house this afternoon. There are documents you need to review. No explanation, no courtesy, just an order." Against every instinct in me, I drove back to Greenwich. The driveway was lined with cars, polished and gleaming like a showroom. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of cedar polish and legal ink. My father sat at the long dining table, his hands folded, his jaw set. Beside him was Evelyn, immaculately dressed, pearls at her throat. At the far end sat a man in a charcoal suit with a leather briefcase resting by his chair. "Madison, this is Daniel Parker, our attorney," Evelyn said. "He's here to help us with some family matters." Daniel rose and shook my hand firmly, his eyes sharp behind thin glasses. "Please have a seat." I lowered myself into a chair, already uneasy. Thomas slid a stack of papers across the table toward me. "We are streamlining the family trust," he said. "For the sake of clarity, it is better to put things in writing now." I glanced at the documents. Legal jargon crowded the pages, but bold headers caught my eye. Waiver of claim. Quitclaim deed. My pulse quickened. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. Daniel folded his hands neatly. "The waiver of claim ensures you forfeit any future contest of the Reed family trust. The quitclaim deed clarifies ownership of the lake house. This way everything is clean, no disputes later." My throat went dry. "You are asking me to give up my rights." Evelyn smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to soothe while it twisted the knife. "It is for everyone's benefit. Olivia and Richard will inherit the responsibilities of the estate. You never wanted to be tied down with obligations like this." I clenched the paper, my nails biting into the edge. "This isn't obligation, this is theft." Thomas's tone hardened. "Watch your words, Madison. These are standard legal measures. We want to avoid messy disputes." "Messy disputes," I repeated under my breath, thinking of every year they had dismissed me, every sacrifice they had demanded. Daniel's voice broke through, calm and precise. "The Uniform Probate Code recognizes these documents as binding. Once signed, there can be no future claim against the estate." I looked at him, at his steady, detached eyes. He was not here to listen, only to make the machine run smoothly. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The lake house was there in black and white, transferred out of reach, a place where summers of my childhood still clung like ghosts. The trust was locked tight, every future decision in Olivia's favor. My name had been erased before the ink was even dry. "No," I said, finally pushing the papers back across the table. Evelyn's smile vanished. "What do you mean, no?" I stood the chair, scraping against the floor. "I will not sign away my life just because it makes things easier for you." Thomas's fist slammed against the table, rattling the glasses. "Don't be foolish, Madison. You cannot fight this. Watch me." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Evelyn's face flushed, her lips pressed thin. She reached for the papers again, tapping them into a neat stack, as though order could restore control. From the doorway, Olivia appeared, her arm looped through Richard's. She had clearly been listening. Richard's eyes landed on me, cool and dismissive. He leaned toward Olivia, his voice low, but not low enough. "She will never dare to go against us." I felt the words strike deliberate and sharp, but I held his gaze. For the first time, I saw not power in his eyes, but arrogance. He believed in his invincibility, and that belief would be his downfall. Without another word, I pushed past them, the papers left abandoned on the table. My heels cracked against the marble, the same sound as last night, but this time I did not feel small. My chest burned with anger, my hands trembled, but beneath it all, there was something steadier, something sharper. It was the beginning of a fight. The subway screeched into the station, and I sat with my sketchbook on my lap, lines smudging under my palm as the city rattled around me. When I finally climbed the stairs back onto the streets of Manhattan, the cold air filled my lungs with something close to relief. My gallery sat on a narrow block in Chelsea, squeezed between a cafe and a boutique that smelled of expensive candles. The glass front reflected the pale morning, and for a moment I simply stared at my name, etched in silver letters across the door. Inside, the space was quiet, except for the hum of the heater. Paintings leaned against the walls, unfinished, restless. Canvases of strangers and faceless figures, shadows of the life I had fought to hold on to. I dropped my bag on the desk just as I saw the envelope lying there, thick and official. My landlord's handwriting glared at me from the corner. I tore it open and scanned the words. Rent increase. Effective next month. Failure to comply will result in termination of lease. My chest tightened. The rent was already a battle. With the increase, it would strangle me. I sat heavily on the stool, the paper limp in my hand. Images of my parents' polished dining table flickered in my mind, of Olivia's smirk, of Richard's contempt. Now here I was, fighting not only for dignity, but for survival. The gallery door swung open, and Claire, my assistant, hurried in with her scarf wrapped high against her chin. She dropped her coffee on the desk and froze when she saw my face. "What happened?" "The rent is going up," I said, my voice flat. "If I don't find the money, we lose the space." She pulled the notice from my hand, her brows knitting. "That's insane. You just renewed 6 months ago. He knows the art district is expanding. He smells blood." She set the paper down carefully, then looked at me. "What do we do?" I stood, forcing the panic to settle. "We find a buyer. I have one on the line already." I grabbed my phone, scrolling to the contact that had been waiting for weeks. A collector in Paris, Monsieur Laurent. He had admired my work in a group exhibition years back, and recently we had exchanged tentative emails. If I could close with him, the rent would not crush me. I dialed, my heart pounding as the line clicked. A rich baritone answered. "Allô. Bonjour, Monsieur Laurent, c'est Madison Reed. Je voulais vous parler de la pièce dont nous avons discuté." The gallery around me blurred as French rolled off my tongue, the words sharp and fluid, rehearsed from years of study and necessity. Claire stared at me, her mouth slightly open. She had never heard me speak like this. "Oui, la toile est disponible. Je peux organiser le transport vers Paris si vous confirmez cette semaine." He responded with interest, his tone warm, intrigued. We discussed measurements, framing, insurance. I scribbled notes on the back of an old flyer, my handwriting jagged from adrenaline. Claire whispered, "Who is that?" I waved her off the phone, pressed tight to my ear. "Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Je vous enverrai les détails par email ce soir. Au revoir." When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. The silence of the gallery closed around me again, but this time it felt different, charged. Claire finally spoke. "You never told me you spoke French." I shrugged, though my chest still throbbed from the rush. "There are a lot of things I never told anyone." Her eyes widened as the truth began to surface. This wasn't just a struggling gallery tucked between boutiques. I had connections, seeds planted, overseas networks that had nothing to do with my family's shadow. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, the passers-by bundled in coats, oblivious to the storm unraveling inside me. My parents thought I had nothing, that I was barely clinging to scraps. Olivia believed her triumph was unshakable. Richard believed no one would ever challenge him. But I had just spoken to Paris from a gallery in Manhattan, closing a deal they would never see coming. For the first time in years, I let myself smile. It was thin, fragile, but it was real. The notice from the landlord still sat on the desk, a threat in black ink. I picked it up, folded it, and slipped it into my drawer. It was not over, not even close. When I unlocked the door to my apartment on the Upper East Side, the city light spilled through the wide windows, 1,000 points of glitter against the velvet night. I set my bag down, the weight of the landlord's notice still pressing on my chest, when I felt the air shift. Someone was already inside. I turned and there he was, standing by the window, with his jacket draped over the back of a chair. Henry's broad frame filled the room, the glow from the skyline cutting sharp angles across his face. His tie was loosened, his cuffs rolled back, but even in that quiet disarray, he looked every inch the man who commanded boardrooms and dictated futures. "You're home late," he said, his voice low but steady. I crossed the room, relief and adrenaline tangling in my veins. There was no need to pretend with him. The day had already stripped me raw. The gallery, the landlord, the papers my parents had tried to force on me, it all sat heavy in my throat. "They tried again," I whispered. "They wanted me to sign everything away." Henry's eyes darkened, not with surprise, but with that quiet fury I had come to know. He stepped closer, one hand brushing down my arm, grounding me. "You didn't sign. Never." "Good." His jaw tightened, then softened as he studied me. "You don't fight battles like these by giving them ammunition. You fight by letting them underestimate you until they cannot anymore." I let out a shaky laugh, pressing my forehead briefly against his chest. He smelled of cedar, and something sharper, the scent of a man who built empires. For so long my family had painted me as powerless. But Henry knew the truth. He had seen me claw my way through years they had written off. And quietly, without ever stepping into their world, he had been there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught. He flipped it open to reveal a diamond necklace, each stone catching the light like captured stars. He held it out to me. "Wear this the next time you walk into their house," he said. "Let them see what they tried to bury." "Henry, it's too much." "It's exactly enough," he answered, his eyes fixed on mine. "They have tried to brand you a failure, but you are standing taller than any of them. This necklace isn't about the diamonds. It's about what it says. It says you are not alone. It says you have already built a life they cannot touch." I lifted the necklace, the cool weight settling into my palm. My throat tightened, not from the gift, but from the truth in his words. My parents had never asked who was behind me, never considered that there could be someone who believed in me fiercely enough to rewrite the story. He fastened it around my neck, his fingers brushing the nape of my skin. When I turned toward the mirror, the diamonds lit up the room, scattering light across the walls. For the first time, I saw myself not as the daughter who had been dismissed, but as a woman who had carved her own place in the world. Henry stepped back, his voice softer now. "The world is going to know you, Madison. And when they do, no contract, no insult, no dismissal will erase it." I swallowed hard, meeting his reflection in the glass. "They'll hate me more for this." "Let them," he said, his tone edged with steel. "Their hate is proof that they can no longer control you." I touched the necklace, feeling its weight, not as a burden, but as armor. The city hummed outside, endless and alive, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Henry crossed the room, pouring 2 glasses of wine from the bottle resting on the counter. He handed one to me, his hand brushing mine just long enough to remind me that I wasn't standing alone anymore. I sipped the wine, rich and grounding, and set the glass down. For years I had hidden this part of my life, kept it sealed away, where my family's contempt couldn't reach. But now, with the diamonds against my skin and Henry's certainty in my veins, I knew hiding was no longer an option. I walked back to the window, the skyline glittering like a promise, and let the silence stretch. The war my parents thought they had already won was only beginning. The morning broke gray and restless, the kind of sky that pressed low against the city, as if it carried secrets of its own. I had just settled into the corner of my gallery office with a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. The name flashing across the screen pulled me upright. Laura Bennett. I answered, and before I could say a word, her voice came sharp and steady. "Check your inbox right now." The urgency in her tone left no room for hesitation. I opened my laptop, fingers trembling slightly as I typed in my password. A new email sat there, flagged with her name. Attached were several files, each stamped with official seals that carried the weight of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. My eyes scanned the first page, the words burning into me. SEC Inquiry, number 2023-48172. Complaint filed under Section 10B and Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act. Allegations of misrepresentation, insider trading, falsified earnings reports. And then the name, Richard Coleman. The blood drained from my face, leaving my hands cold, even as the heat of the coffee cup pressed against my palm. Laura's voice broke through the haze. "This is not rumor, Maddie. These are official filings. The man your sister is parading around as a financial genius is about to be eaten alive by the system he thought he controlled." I leaned back in my chair, my chest rising and falling as I tried to process the enormity of it. The very man Olivia and my parents had used as a weapon against me, the proof of their endless taunts and comparisons, was standing on the edge of ruin. Laura's tone softened, though it carried steel beneath it. "I thought you should know first. You deserve to know." I whispered my thanks, my voice catching, and ended the call. The document still glowed on the screen, line after line of damning detail. Richard's empire, his confidence, his arrogance. It was already crumbling brick by brick under the weight of federal scrutiny. And yet, even as I sat there, Olivia was no doubt floating through the family's orbit, bragging about his supposed triumphs. I could almost hear her voice in my head, syrupy and smug, spinning fantasies. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with a family group message. Olivia had posted a photo, her manicured hand pointing to a glossy brochure for a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The caption read, "Soon to be ours." My stomach twisted, not from envy, but from the cruel irony of it all. She had no idea. None of them did. They were laughing over champagne, convinced that Richard's money would pave their road to glory forever, while the ground beneath their feet was already splitting apart. That evening, I met Laura for coffee near Bryant Park. She leaned across the table, her auburn hair falling against her cheek, eyes sharp behind her glasses. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said quietly. "When the hearings go public, it won't just be his career on the line. His reputation, his freedom, everything is at risk." I stared at the steam curling from my cup, thinking of Olivia's sparkling smile as she flaunted that Hamptons dream. They had turned me into a ghost in my own family, but now I held knowledge that would unravel their illusions thread by thread. Laura touched my hand, grounding me. "Be careful with this, Maddie. Timing is everything." I nodded, tucking the files back into my bag. She was right. There was no satisfaction in running to my parents with proof and screaming, "Look who you chose." The real victory would come when the truth revealed itself inescapably, publicly, undeniably. As I walked back through the city streets, the lights overhead blurred in the misty drizzle. I felt the necklace against my collarbone, its weight reminding me of Henry's words. This was not about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had stripped from me for years. I reached my apartment and set the folder on my desk. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, vast and unbothered. Somewhere in another corner of the city, Olivia was likely swirling wine in her glass, describing every detail of the oceanfront kitchen she believed she would soon own. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the irony settle like a secret smile at the back of my throat. The house in the Hamptons was nothing but a mirage, and I was holding the desert wind that would sweep it away. The city outside pulsed with its endless rhythm, and for the first time in years, I felt it match the beat inside my chest. The salt air clung to my skin as the yacht cut across the waters off Maui, the horizon stretching in every direction like a canvas painted in deep blues and golds. For a moment it felt like freedom, the kind of escape I used to dream about when I was younger. But the sound of the helicopter overhead reminded me that even here, We were not alone. Henry stood near the railing, his sunglasses catching the glare of the late afternoon sun. He had been on the phone for the past hour, his voice low and clipped words carried away by the wind before I could piece them together. When he finally slipped the phone back into his pocket, his jaw was set. "They found us, didn't they?" I said quietly, watching the shape of a speedboat lingering too close on the horizon. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Paparazzi. Someone must have leaked our flight plan out of LAX." I wrapped the silk scarf tighter around my shoulders, though the air was warm. The thought of my life, our life, plastered across glossy pages for strangers to dissect, churned my stomach. For so long I had lived in shadows invisible to my family, and now the opposite threatened to swallow me whole. Henry crossed the deck, his hand warm against the small of my back. "I'll have security tighten the perimeter," he said softly. "You don't have to worry." I wanted to believe him, but as the flash of a long lens glinted in the distance, I knew the illusion of privacy was already slipping away. The ocean breeze carried voices from the crew below, hurried tense as they adjusted sails and shifted course. Later, as the sun sank lower, we sat together at a table set with crystal glasses and fresh-caught ahi, the sky above bleeding into orange and violet. I tried to focus on the beauty on the way the water shimmered like molten metal, but the hum of drones hovering above gnawed at the edges of my calm. Henry poured wine into my glass, his movements deliberate, steady, the opposite of the unease tightening my chest. "This was supposed to be our sanctuary," I whispered, "a place where no one could reach us." He took my hand across the table, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "That's exactly what it still is, Maddie. They can point their cameras, but they will never capture the truth we choose to keep." I searched his eyes looking for cracks, but all I saw was determination. Even so, I caught the flicker of tension in the line of his shoulders, the weight he carried to shield me from a world eager to pry open every corner of our lives. As twilight deepened, we moved to the upper deck. The crew had managed to lose the trailing boat, but I could still feel eyes on us. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of salt and plumeria. I leaned against the railing, watching the waves fold into each other, the endless rhythm that made my worries feel small, yet sharper at the same time. Henry came to stand beside me. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and drew out a small velvet box. My breath caught as he opened it, revealing the diamond necklace he had given me before its facets catching the last rays of light, until it seemed to set the air around us ablaze. He lifted it carefully, stepping closer, his voice low enough that it felt carved into the wind. "Wear it when the time comes. You won't be standing alone." The chill that had clung to me all day eased as the necklace settled against my skin. The diamonds were cool at first, then warm with my body's heat, heavy with promise. I closed my eyes, letting his words sink into the part of me that had always feared abandonment, the part that still carried echoes of my parents' disdain and Olivia's smirk. The hum of the yacht softened into background music as I leaned into him, the horizon burning with the last of the sun. Whatever storm waited ahead for the first time, I felt the steel of certainty, not just in myself, but in the man beside me. Far off, a camera flash split the dusk, but I did not flinch. I lifted my chin, the necklace catching the light, and breathed in the sea air until it steadied me completely. The train ride back to Connecticut was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched and pressed against the windows until it filled every corner of the car. I watched the blur of trees and small towns slip by, each one carrying memories I thought I had left behind years ago. When I stepped off at the station near my grandmother's house, the air felt softer than the city, tinged with the faint smell of lilacs, even though it was too late in the season for blooms. Grandma Rose lived in a white clapboard house with green shutters, a place that always seemed untouched by time. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it, and before I could knock, the door opened. She stood there in her cardigan, her silver hair tied neatly at the back, her eyes sharper than anyone half her age. "Maddie," she said, her voice warm in a way I had not heard from anyone else in weeks. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me." I stepped into her arms, the familiar scent of lavender and cinnamon wrapping around me like a blanket. How could I forget, Grandma? She guided me inside to the living room where lace curtains filtered the late afternoon light and a teapot waited on the coffee table. We sat together, and she poured tea with steady hands that had raised children, buried friends, and seen enough winters to know patience was its own kind of power. "You've been carrying something heavy," she said after a long sip. "You do not need to tell me everything. I already know more than you think." I froze the cup, trembling slightly between my fingers. "Know what?" Her eyes held mine, clear and unwavering. "About Henry. About the marriage." My breath hitched, the weight of secrecy pressing down on me. "How long?" She smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried no judgment. "Longer than you imagine. I knew the day you showed up in that silk dress with a new steadiness in your eyes. I have waited for you to tell me yourself." I put the cup down, unable to hide the tremor in my hands. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because, my darling, timing matters. Some truths must ripen before they are shared. And I trusted you would know when the world was ready to see who you are." She leaned down and reached for a small wooden box under the side table. She set it between us, the grain worn smooth by decades of use. "Open it." I hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon photographs from years ago, and folded receipts yellowed with age. The first letter was in my grandmother's careful script, written to the admissions office of the Rhode Island School of Design. My name glowed from the page, proof that someone had believed in my future when my own parents had stolen it. The photographs were of my very first gallery, showing prints I had thought were lost forever. I traced the edges, memories flooding back of standing in that small space, my heart pounding as strangers looked at my work. And the receipts. Tuition payments, supplies, donations, each one signed by Rose Bennett. The tears came before I could stop them. I covered my mouth, shaking, as she reached across and placed her hand on mine. "You thought you did this alone," she said softly. "But I have been standing behind you from the start, even if you could not see me." I bent forward, the tears soaking her cardigan as I clung to her. For the first time in so long, the walls I had built around myself cracked open. Someone had known, had cared, had fought for me in silence, when the voices that should have mattered most only tore me down. When I finally lifted my head, her eyes were wet too, but steady. "You are not alone, Maddie. You have never been alone." The weight of years of dismissal, ridicule, and abandonment shifted inside me, lighter now, because someone had chosen to carry it with me. I pressed the letters to my chest, as if they could stitch together every wound left by my parents' words. The evening light slipped across the floor, painting the room in gold. My grandmother poured more tea, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly seen. The lights of the hotel ballroom glowed even in the late evening, spilling out into the courtyard, where staff hurried back and forth with crates of flowers and champagne. Tomorrow the place would be overflowing with guests, and tonight every detail was being rehearsed as if it were a Broadway show. I stood near the edge of the room, invisible to most of them, watching as my mother and father practiced their speeches with champagne flutes in hand, their voices dripping with admiration for Olivia and her perfect fiancé. "Madison," my mother said sharply when she caught my eye. "Tomorrow you will not make a scene. You will not speak, not even a word. This is Olivia's day, and you will sit quietly and respect that." I nodded without answering, because there was no space for protest. Their eyes were fixed only on Olivia, who stood in the center of the ballroom like a queen rehearsing her coronation. She held out her hand, her fingers slender, and manicured the diamond on her ring, sparkling under the chandeliers. "Isn't it stunning?" she asked, her voice pitched just loud enough for me to hear. $200,000, Richard insisted, nothing less would do. She tilted her head, her smile smug, as she let the light catch on the stone again and again. Around her, bridesmaids gasped and laughed, and my father clapped Richard on the back as if he were already a son. I watched the performance unfold, a gilded stage where every word and every gesture was rehearsed to exclude me. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I stepped away from the crowd to the hallway and glanced at the screen. A message from Laura lit up the display. "Tomorrow morning the Times is running the piece. Full financial breakdown, SEC inquiry, the works. He won't be able to hide it." My pulse quickened. Richard's empire of smoke and mirrors was about to collapse, and Olivia, in her blind devotion, had no idea she was standing on quicksand. I tucked the phone away and walked back into the ballroom, my face carefully neutral, my steps steady. Olivia twirled once in the middle of the room, holding up her ring for the planners to admire again. My mother clapped politely. My father dabbed at his eyes as if overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. And me? I was placed at the far corner table tucked behind a pillar where no one would see me, where my presence would not taint their picture-perfect celebration. I traced the rim of my water glass, the sound faint under the hum of their laughter. Every detail screamed of exclusion, of deliberate cruelty masked as etiquette. Yet as I sat there, I felt something different rising in me. Not despair, not humiliation, but resolve. The stronger they pushed me into the shadows, the brighter I knew I would shine when my time came. The orchestra began its rehearsal, a sweeping waltz filling the room. Olivia leaned into Richard's arm, tilting her head back with theatrical joy. I closed my eyes for a moment, the music vibrating through the floor, and let my determination settle. They thought they had silenced me, but silence is never permanent. It waits, it gathers, and when it finally breaks, it is louder than any song they could ever play. I opened my eyes again and fixed them on Olivia, her laughter floating across the ballroom. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle basking in the glow of admiration and wealth. And tomorrow cracks would begin to show in the glass castle she had built. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled to myself, a smile no one noticed. Tonight they thought I was buried under their contempt. Tomorrow I would begin to rise. The morning of the wedding broke sharp and clear the skyline of New York, cutting against a sky too blue to feel real. By the time evening fell, the hotel glowed like a jewel box on Fifth Avenue, every window blazing, every doorman standing at attention. Black cars lined the street, their doors opening to spill out gowns and tuxedos, glittering jewelry, and perfectly rehearsed smiles. Inside the ballroom dripped with orchids and crystal, a cathedral built for show. Olivia and Richard took their positions at the center, bathed in the glow of chandeliers, smiling as if they were carved out of marble. I arrived deliberately late. The murmurs rippled before me as the double doors opened. The gown clung to me in sleek silk, hand-stitched from Paris, a piece meant to stop hearts. My heels struck the marble, each step measured, and beside me, Henry walked with a calm that radiated power. His tailored suit cut sharp lines, his presence filling the space before we even reached the carpet. The flashes hit instantly. Paparazzi had found their way inside their cameras, lifted like weapons bulbs exploding in rapid-fire bursts. The guest list had leaked. I knew it the moment the first question was shouted, my name tumbling into the air along with Henry's. Gasps filled the corridor as more photographers pushed through the doors, lenses trained on us like predators catching prey. I did not flinch. I placed my hand lightly on Henry's arm, lifting my chin, as if the blaze of cameras was nothing more than a summer breeze. Together we stepped forward, and the crowd parted without needing to be told. Inside the ballroom, the music stuttered, then faltered entirely. Olivia froze mid-turn, her hand extended in yet another display of her ring. For a moment she stood statuesque, but then her face crumpled into disbelief. Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, as if the weight of what he saw pressed on his chest. And Richard. Richard's color drained the moment Henry came fully into view. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted away and back, and his hand that had been gripping Olivia's waist fell to his side. Whispers flooded the room. That's Henry Blackwood. My God, what is he doing here? With her? Henry inclined his head politely, his smile just enough to acknowledge but never concede. He guided me through the crowd, each step deliberate, the circle widening until we reached the table they had relegated me to, the one half hidden by a pillar. But tonight, no pillar could make me invisible. Every gaze followed. Every flash chased me. Olivia's voice cracked first. What is this? She tried to laugh, a brittle sound, but it broke in her throat. I met her eyes and held them calm steady, as if this moment had been rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind. Henry leaned toward me slightly, his words low but deliberate. "You are not the shadow here. Not tonight." The orchestra scrambled to begin again, but the notes collapsed against the tension choking the air. A planner rushed toward Olivia, whispering frantically, but she shoved him away. Evelyn clutched Richard's arm as if he might explain, but Richard's stare remained locked on Henry. And in that silence the truth bled through louder than any denial could. I sat folding my gown beneath me, my hands still and steady on the tablecloth. The flashes outside the windows flickered, and the murmurs thickened into a roar. Every eye in that room had once been trained on Olivia. Tonight, without a word, they were mine. A vibration buzzed against my wrist, and I glanced down to see Laura's name lighting up the screen. The headline was already out, bold letters cutting across the digital page, with the SEC inquiry number stamped right beneath it, a filing no one could dismiss. I lifted my gaze and watched the ripples spread. Guests leaned across tables, whispering, phones appearing in hands like wildfire catching. A woman gasped aloud, another clapped a hand over her mouth. The orchestra faltered again, and this time it did not recover. Richard stiffened his eyes, darting from one glowing phone to another, watching the tide turn against him. His smile collapsed, his hand shaking, as he lifted his glass and then slammed it back onto the table, wine spilling dark across the linen. "What did you do?" he hissed at me, his voice sharp enough to slice through the murmur of the crowd. "You think this makes you strong? You think this makes you anything? You are nothing." The words hit like the echo of every insult my family had ever carved into me. But this time I did not flinch. The sting burned, yes, but it was his voice that cracked, not mine. Henry rose slowly, the scrape of his chair deliberate, the hush falling heavy, as if the whole ballroom leaned in to listen. He did not raise his tone. He did not need to. "Touch my wife again and see." The stillness that followed was suffocating. Richard's face mottled with rage, but he said nothing. His fists clenched, his knuckles white, yet his body betrayed the fear his words could not cover. Olivia grabbed his arm, desperate, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Say something, Richard. Tell them it is not true. Please." But he stared at Henry, his lips pressed tight, his silence damning him louder than any confession. The guests turned one by one, their eyes shifting from him to me, their whispers rising like a tide. Some pulled out their phones again, snapping photos, recording the moment, as if history was unfolding right there in satin and glass. Evelyn's voice cut in high and shrill, trying to patch over the fracture. "This is slander, ridiculous lies none of you should believe." But no one listened. Thomas's hand fell heavy on hers, his face pale, his certainty crumbling with every vibration of a phone, every headline that spread faster than she could speak. I felt the weight of their eyes, all of them, not pressing me down this time, but lifting me, pulling me forward into the space they had tried to bury me under for years. For the first time in that room, I was not the shadow. I was the fire catching light. Olivia's lips trembled as she looked at me, pleading without words. Her diamond ring sparkled under the chandelier, but her hand shook so violently it caught no admiration. The silence grew again, thick and choking, every gaze demanding someone fill it. Richard stayed still. Olivia clutched him tighter, and I simply breathed steady, unmoved. The ballroom no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. Reporters swarmed outside the hotel before the night even ended, their voices rising above the hum of idling black cars as headlines lit up across every screen. By morning, Richard's name was plastered on financial news tickers, the SEC issuing a subpoena that stripped him of his polished mask. The board of his company moved swiftly, suspending him from his role as CFO, and the empire he flaunted cracked wide open. Olivia vanished from the society pages, her honeymoon quietly canceled, while whispers of shame followed her through every door. I watched it all unfold from a distance, the newsprint and glowing screens no longer carrying the sting they once did. Instead, they were evidence. Proof that the shadows I had carried for years were finally dragged into the light. 2 weeks later, the knock on my gallery door was hesitant, the kind of sound made by people who once entered without asking. I opened it to find Evelyn and Thomas standing there older, somehow their faces lined not only by age, but by regret. Evelyn's eyes glistened, her voice catching, as she said my name like it was both an apology and a plea. "We were wrong, Madison." Her words cracked her hands twisting together. "We failed you." Thomas stood beside her, his usual certainty gone, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his choices had finally come crashing down. I stepped aside and let them in, not out of duty, but because I no longer feared them. They sat across from me, tears falling freely now, asking for forgiveness they could not name, trying to erase years of dismissal with words too late. I listened quietly, and when the silence stretched between us, I spoke with a calm that came from somewhere deeper than anger. "I already have a family. I already have a life I chose." Their tears fell harder then, but I did not move to comfort them. Some things are not mine to mend. Later that week, I visited Grandma Rose, her home filled with the scent of old books and lavender. She pressed a small wooden box into my hands, its surface worn smooth from years of care. Inside were letters she had written, but never sent, photographs from my first gallery showing, and receipts from tuition she had secretly paid when my parents would not. Her eyes shone as she closed my fingers over the box. "I always believed in you. I was just waiting for the day you would believe in yourself too." I wept then, not from pain, but from the release of it, letting her hold me, as I finally felt what it was to be truly seen without condition. When I returned to Manhattan, Henry was waiting. His hand found mine, with the kind of steadiness that had anchored me through every storm. That night, he took me west, away from the familiar streets and noise, to the coast, where the Pacific spread wide and endless before us. The gates opened to reveal the Malibu estate, its glass walls glowing softly under the California dusk. $30 million of stone and ocean air, but more than that, it was a place untouched by the shadows of my past. As I walked through the rooms, light spilling across polished floors, Henry placed his arm around me and whispered that this was home. For the first time, I believed it. I stood on the balcony that overlooked the waves, the necklace glinting at my throat, the wooden box from Grandma Rose warm in my hands. The voices that once called me a failure were gone, replaced by the sound of the tide pulling steady against the shore. I did not seek vengeance in blood. I sought it in truth, in the quiet strength of choosing my own path, in the unshakable value of knowing who I was when no one else could see it. And in that truth, I found not revenge, but freedom. If this story has reached you, stay with me for more journeys of justice and self-respect, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is living the life they said you never could.